Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Retro Radio number 4 with special guest Pifafu from OP Labs. Super happy to have you here with us, Biff. Thank you for joining. I heard from a little birdie that this is your first time on Twitter Spaces, so we're honored.
Yeah, that is true. I've never joined as a speaker, so this will be a first for me.
Amazing. Well, you're doing great so far. You managed to join, get on stage, and speak, which, believe it or not, is further than a lot of people get. So glad we were able to get you on here to chat just a little bit about. I'd love to just hear a little bit about your journey as a designer, maybe a little bit about your crypto journey, and then definitely want to chat about OP Labs, Optimism, and Retro PGF. So let's get right into it, and people can join as they like. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and your career. It says in your bio here on Twitter, sorry X, that you used to be at GitHub. Is that where you got your start?
Um, Almost. I actually had my start at I kind of joke that it was a fake startup, a fake tech startup, because I'm not really sure what they really did. I think they were trying to find a business model when I joined, but I started my design career at a company called Million Eye in Pleasanton, and
This is
I
the
was
fake
there.
startup, or this is a different place?
This is like the fake tech startup. I think they were like a party goods company, and they tried to pivot into the tech space when that was getting big, but they didn't have a real product, and they were trying to find a product, I think. And I spent
Sounds like a really fun. It sounds like a really fun company to have to do branding for.
yeah, what was really good about that place was that even though it wasn't like, they didn't have a real tech business and they didn't have real software they were shipping yet. I did have an amazing design mentor who kind of knew the state of the business, and thus he invested just a ton of energy into mentoring me, since that was where he saw him having profound impact. Was just to level up this newbie designer, me, in her
Well,
first
that's nice.
job. Um,
It's very cool when you come across mentors in your life. It doesn't always happen when you want it to, but it's nice when it does.
for sure, yeah. So that was an amazing start for me. I was there for about less than a year, and then through I won't get into the story of how I ended up there, but I eventually, after I was at this fake startup for a year, I ended up at Patreon as their first designer. And
Oh wow!
this was when they had like 10 or 11 employees. We were like working out of the CEO's bedroom, and all of us were very young, and we none of us had real tech
It's a
experience
weird
yet.
thing. It's a weird thing to have to put on your CV. Working out of the CEO's bedroom.
Yeah, it lasted for a month, and then we got an office because they raised Series A. But that was, I think, my first real job in tech, because Patreon had a business. It already had product market fit, and as you can see today, they've obviously grown and were able to take that into many other series of fundraising. Um,
Very cool.
so from Patreon, as I mentioned, I was the first designer there. I think I must have been 24 when I joined. So still very little work experience, given that I came from a company that didn't really have a real product or real software they were building. Um,
The more you talk about this original company, the more I'm picturing the show Silicon Valley. Is that what?
it's kind of like that, yeah. Anyways, when I was at Patreon, didn't have a, I didn't have a mentor there, unlike my first place. So I was there for about a year and a half, and I think that Patreon was a place where I really vibed with what they were doing. They were empowering the creative class. They wanted to give more power back to creators, wanted creators, especially of digital artifacts, to be able to benefit from work that they typically give out to the public for free, online art, online content.
Yeah.
And I really became passionate about that. Everyone that worked there was so passionate about that. Many of them were online content creators themselves. And working in a place where you truly give a shit about the mission and you believe that the work that you do can make an impact, at least for me when I was young, it just led me to burn myself out pretty quickly, especially given that I didn't have a mentor there and I didn't have a design team that I was learning from. And so that ultimately was why I left Patreon and went to GitHub. My journey to GitHub was pretty straightforward. I was just looking for really a design team. I recognized that in order for me to really be able to level myself up to contribute something meaningful to the missions that I cared about, I needed to improve myself, and I needed a team that had experience that I could learn from. And so I applied to GitHub. I saw that they at the time they were one of the few companies in San Francisco that were okay with remote first work. GitHub has always been a remote first company, and
they were before their time.
yeah, it was right. It was before a bunch of tech companies moved to that model, and really that was actually the only reason that I applied to GitHub. I wasn't very close to developers. I didn't really know what GitHub was as a product. I've never used it. I didn't know what Git was. I didn't know what a pull request was, but I applied because they said, "Oh, we're a remote first company, and therefore you can work from wherever, and your hours are more flexible." And I was like, "Oh, hell yeah, that sounds chill." And I was so burnt out,
Mm-hmm.
so I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. They'll probably, my experience isn't super relevant. They'll probably not interview me, but one thing led to another, and I ended up there for 6 years.
That's pretty cool. So then I guess you got pretty versed on all things developer in your time there, more so than you were prior.
Yeah, for sure. I became very passionate about, I would still say I'm not super fluent in developer tooling, despite having worked at GitHub for so long. A lot of the things that I was responsible for had to do with identity. So I was responsible for GitHub profiles for a long time. I helped seed the project management product, which is just called projects, I think, on GitHub. And I also spent some time working on GitHub sponsors when they first launched. So a lot of my work at GitHub had to do with open communities and had to do with identity and reputation and acknowledgement for work. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, through all of the activity that you do on a day to day when you're shipping software, what are the artifacts that we pull from that we can put on your profile so that your profile becomes a accurate signal for the kind of communities that you participate in, the kind of development work that you do, because the profile is like so important to a lot of developers in general. Like typically when you apply for jobs, people want to see you get a profile. They want to see the quality of your code. They want to see if you contribute to open source and what that looks like. So
Yeah, speaking of being ahead of their time, I think this is something actually that we're seeing now is needed in crypto at large for, so many organizations with contributors all over the world, and many of them might be anon or pseudo anon, and there really is a need to know, sort of similar to what GitHub does for developers, what is this person's core strength, what have they executed on, and whatnot. So I think our space could learn a lot from from what GitHub has done and learned.
yeah, I really agree with that. I think that that's a nice segue into why I joined OP Labs and why I'm invested in optimism. Because I guess if you
Yeah.
look at the two companies the two real tech companies that I was an employee of for the past decade, both of them focused on empowering essentially builders, right? Like Patreon focused on digital creators and content creators, and GitHub focused on literal developers. And at OP Labs, we care about both. We care about people who are on the more creative ends of contribution and creation, and also on the more technical end of building and shipping software. And I think it's a nice through line between all of the different problems that I have been thinking about in the past decade. And I do think that GitHub's model, not just how they, not even just how they like have built tools for open source and allow communities to be working in the open, but they even follow that model internally. So GitHub is like a wonderful example of a reflection of
Being
internal
the dog food.
culture, shipping software that helps them operate, that ends up influencing how other communities across the internet coordinate and work together.
Interestingly, I've always held that up as a sort of an ideal of what it means to be nounish as well,
Mm,
where a lot of the infra that we have funded over the years has been infra that has a direct use within the Nouniverse, but then hopefully it's open source and hopefully it has uses for other DAOs outside, even up to and including the fork that we just had. Maybe some other DAOs can use this to get out of a pickle easier than we did this time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the things that working, like using GitHub to build software or using GitHub to ship parts of GitHub, the thing that I think works so incredibly well um, with using GitHub as a tool for working in the open or coordinating in the open or coordinating with open communities is that regardless of when you enter the community, you can basically be an archaeologist and dig through past issues to really understand the discussion and the sentiment around a particular topic at the time. Like, for example, something that I grappled with for literally 6 years at GitHub and has not really changed in the user-facing product is the contribution graph. So for those who are, hi Jonas, for those who are not super familiar with the contribution graph, it's basically on every GitHub profile. So on your user profile, there's this chart. If there are Nouners here who use Nouns Agora, they have a version of this. They
Yeah.
have this little graph that shows, okay.
Yeah, Agora is a great example, by the way, of what we were just talking about too. Something that was funded by Nouns and then, just went out and made that accessible and useful for OP, for I think ENS, and for several other DAOs.
Yeah,
So
we love to see it. It's probably Agora is one of my actually most used products because it provides a real utility and it's something that I use not because I'm into like crypto necessarily, but because I'm invested in the Nows community and it helps me vote on props and whatever. But anyways, there's this contribution graph on the Nouns Agora profile that shows, how like when somebody voted and like what that proposal was, and if they voted yes or no, you kind of see the green if it's yes, red if it's no. Well, that pattern was derived from GitHub. I know this because I spoke to Etong for a bit, but essentially on your GitHub user profile, you have this graph, and every single day for 365 days, there's like one box that represents did you push a commit to GitHub that day.
It's kind of almost become a meme on like dev Twitter. If you go, like people
Yeah,
will kind of be like showing off their boxes. So definitely a good meme to come out of GitHub. And I actually remember when Yutong dropped that when he was just working on it, and he dropped it in one of the discords saying, "What do you guys think?" And everyone was like, "Yes, this is so amazing. It's such a great way of visualizing contribution."
yeah, it is. And I think that, GitHub found the same like power through that interface. And that's why it's been the staple of the profile for, I think, over 8 years now. It was there before I joined, so I'm not responsible for introducing that UI. But it's something that people became extremely attached to because it was a very literal representation of did they code that day. And now the contribution graph also creates a green square if you open an issue, or I think also if you comment on stuff. So it's broader now than just pushing commits, and it's a broader representation of your GitHub activity than if you just were doing something with code. But for a while, it was just code. And so what we saw, what I think will be interesting, an interesting, I guess, analogy for maybe some of the cultural moments that I've seen in Nouns already, being a somewhat new observer, is the contribution graph, because people were so passionate about it and because it was tied to their identity. It formed two camps of belief. Like one camp believed that the contribution graph was good and that it was motivating and that you should have it because it helps people create like it helps people essentially like feel motivated to practice development every day. So people who are just starting out, they would look to the contribution graph and feel proud of like, a very filled out graph because it showed to them that they were able to make progress every day and they were able to make commits every day, and that's something to feel good about. And then there was a camp of people, and then, along with the people who felt it was a good thing, I think there was also somewhat of an incorrect interpretation of the graph, which is people started to see that as a representation of how passionate you were about development and being a developer. And they also saw it as a sign of how good of a developer you were, which are not things that you can actually abstract from the graph. It's obviously like a very, very, very basic view of just how active you are on GitHub and how actively you push commits, but it doesn't determine
and
if the
obviously
commits
at a
are high
glance,
quality.
exactly, and at a glance, you can't tell just looking at someone's profile the quality of their coding
Right.
that quickly. But there is something to be said for someone that is, like you said, active and they're in the arena, as it were, doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're inspiring me now. I feel like we need to make a the Noun Square version of the GitHub. We just have 512 straight days of spaces and green squares.
Yeah, like
Someone needs to make this happen for us. It'll make us feel good.
yeah, I think as you and I talk about this, you'll see that like the challenge, the problems and opportunities that I spent time thinking about at GitHub, I applied to almost every single job that and project that I've held, both at GitHub and at OP Labs. So to go back to that, the other camp that it formed, the other camp that the contribution graph helped form was a group of people who believed that having the graph was not good, that it was motivating toxic behaviors, and that people were feeling like they were obligated to generate bullshit commits to random repositories in order to keep their graph green, because they knew that there was this interpretation of the graph that was prevalent in both technical and non-technical communities looking at GitHub profiles, because people thought, oh, if a graph is very empty, it means that you're not committed to your work. It means that you're not passionate about building software, blah, 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 like all of those signals that are incorrect. And so they believed that having the contribution graph was a bad thing and that it was unhealthy, and that moreover, it didn't even represent how good, somebody was as a how quality their code might be or how experienced that person might be. So why even have it? And anyways, I'm summarizing a lot, but that was essentially, these two camps of belief that formed out of the graph existing. And I think that the analogy that I'll pull to Ethereum is that or to any technology in general, is that the technology usually in and of itself is not good or evil. It's just the context that it sits within and the sort of incentive structures that you build around it that motivate human behavior. And so, us, by having a contribution graph, the opinion that GitHub is sharing with the world is that it believes that it is valuable to show whether somebody has committed code that day or not. Like that was the starting, I think, unconscious, almost implicit idea that was being shared. I can't say if
It's just a tool, right? And I
mm-hmm,
mean, people hiring for projects still can ultimately make the decision whether they think that tool is useful,
mm-hmm,
or whether it's just a starting point, or whether it's the be all end all. But yeah, it's just a tool.
right. And I think that like when you don't have other, quantifications that sit alongside such a prominent piece of interface, then what people are interpreting when they look at a user profile is, oh, this must be one of the more important things about how to assess developers. And I think that, anyways, this debate between should we get rid of the graph, should we add more to the graph and give people more data to assess from, like that debate just went on endlessly. And
Where did you fall on that debate? I'm curious.
my belief was that the data itself is not good or evil. Obviously, it can create very positive outcomes, like people feeling motivated to practice their code tutorials every day, and it could also create toxic feelings that people had, where they felt like they needed to keep their graph green, even though it didn't really represent who they were as a developer. And my belief was that if you're only going to have a graph that visualizes commit activity or things like if you opened an issue that day, then of course people are going to think, people who start to develop a more nuanced view over it will start to think that it's not useful, because it's such a black and white and limited view of if somebody is a quality developer or not. And I think that the real solution isn't should you keep the graph or should you get rid of the graph? The solution is, okay, well, what other signals are people really interested in that we can introduce in the profile so that the contribution graph isn't the most prominent visual thing, and two, you're not trying to, like, you don't oversimplify things that are much more nuanced, right? Like, I think what the graph seems to do, even though that was never the intent, is that it simplifies the quality of your code and how much code you've written to sort of mean something good or bad about you, when it's not trying to do that at all. It's just a very neutral representation of, did you commit that day? And that's the only question that that graph is trying to answer. It's not trying to answer how passionate somebody is or how good their code is.
Right.
But people derive that meaning because they like to see a number be high and they want that to mean something.
Yeah, I feel like being against the GitHub graph is kind of like saying I don't think pie charts should exist because now we can see that 80% of Americans like cookies, and that's not fair.
Yeah, yeah. And so the thing that I was thinking about for nouns and what I've been feeling for nouns was, this contribution graph thing. It was like both a debate in the public and a debate in private repository. So GitHub coordinates all of their work through private repos, and we work in the same way that open source communities work through GitHub issues and GitHub discussions and pull requests and whatnot. And so me as an employee, I was able to query in GitHub contribution graph and just see issues across the internal GitHub organization. And I can see how people across the org have talked about it for the last decade. And that, as a new employee, was really fascinating because I didn't need to be there for any of those conversations to inherit the thinking or to develop a brand new opinion on it, because there have been so many people in the past that have already been thinking about this and having like heated debates about it. And it was also truly open. So one of my favorite resources as I was designing the GitHub profile and trying to understand how developers felt about it and what the core opportunities and problems were, I would search this repository. I think it's under Isaac's. It's like Isaac's Dear GitHub repository, where the open source community pens a lot of like requests to GitHub about features they want and issues that they're having. And there's this massive thread. I think it's still in the open. There's this massive thread that just talks about the contribution graph. And so I would spend a long time going through every comment and reading, like, what do people feel and what are their issues with it and what are the both sides, and taking all of that juicy user sentiment and abstracting that into the actual problems and opportunities that we could work on internally to address some of the pain and frustration we saw in the community. And it reminds me of the thing that I really craved when I started to start to explore nouns, is this very queryable, accessible, historical artifact of how the community has felt about certain topics and some of the open debate and conversations they've had. Like, for example, the fork. That topic, it was kind of hard for me to develop my own opinion on without being able to see all the conversations in the past that have occurred around it, because so much of design is just forming a strong opinion after you've heard many other opinions from other people who are actually domain experts or have lived that experience and can give you an anecdote. So yeah, I think that the challenge with open communities is that without a centralized place to share information or to have discussions, it is a little hard to understand what's going on. But I'm excited about the opportunity that a lot of builders have to sort of address that issue and make that data, whether it's like attestations or whatever, to make that data open so that we can build many instances of interacting with that data or querying that data, so that we can develop an understanding of how the nouns community evolved and what were the major events in nouns history that led to big pivotal changes like the fork or whatever.
Right, and also like who are the players, especially in a community like Nouns where many people are pseudonymous. We need to have ways to be able to sort of measure the contributions essentially of different individuals in the ecosystem. Like, imagine how much better Nouns would be if we kind of knew not who was bidding on the auction, but like what kind of person was bidding on the
Mm-hmm.
auction, or what their contributions have been in the past. And that way, you're not making like any kind of judgments about individuals. You're just literally looking at a glance and saying, okay, this person's likely to do this, and you can make decisions based on that.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that one of my favorite things about Nouns Agora, I haven't actually used that many other sites or front ends for accessing proposals or actually submitting my vote. So my main experience is through Agora. I'm not sure how it differs or whether it differs that much from other interfaces, but one of my favorite things about Nouns Agora is on the delegate profile, delegates have the option first to have a profile and insure themselves, which I think is pretty table stakes. And then the other thing is that there are
I once had a viral tweet, by the way, that
uh-huh.
said Nouns Agora is the new LinkedIn, and I don't know if you took that.
Yeah,
It's the new.
I think that is like what happens when a profile or a representation of digital identity actually becomes useful is that it starts to become a thing that you use to represent your work, right? It's not a social profile, it's a reflection of your contributions. And on the delegate profile for Nouns, one of my favorite things is that you have the option to select some of the themes that the community cares about, like proliferating nouns, or what else do I have? Builder funding. Like you get to state what your views are on those things, your top issues. And I think that to go a step further, what would be useful is if you could actually start to connect some of that voting history back to what this delegate said their top issues were and where they fall on those issues. I think that you can and should do the same for builders, like people who actually make the proposals. It should be easy for me to look at their profile and see past work that they've done. What's their track record been like? And
To that end, there is a new protocol called Prop Dates that Wilson Cusack wrote a contract for, and Martin has done a quick front end that he's elaborating on over the next 3 months, I believe. And that's
mm-hmm,
exactly what that is meant for: is that every proposal can do an update essentially to keep people up to date. And I mean that's the that's the hardware. That's the software. But what we really need to also do is like change the culture to and expect that when proposers come back for new proposals that they're going to have prop dates on all their previous
mm-hmm,
stuff. Yeah,
yeah,
and I'm sure Yutong's already working on piping that prop dates data into the Agora front end as well because it'll be useful there.
for sure. Yeah, I think like I don't know my views on this because I spent so long on GitHub profiles, and it's a very different profile space than the the profiles I typically interact with in my day to day. Like I have my Twitter profile, I have my Instagram profile, I have my LinkedIn. I don't actually interact with it that much, but like so many of my profiles are just like a social footprint. Whereas
Yeah, there's not as many filters on the GitHub profiles.
yeah, like GitHub is
Hashtag no
all
filter.
about your work and how you contributed to different projects. And I think that in the Web3 space and in communities in particular that have a lot of builders and they fund builders and they fund builders building projects in the open, it's just really valuable to think about identity in terms of how profiles can be a signal for your contribution quality or your reputation, and use that as a use that as a key pillar in this virtuous cycle where when you enter you are maybe able to find opportunities that match your skill set or your level of participation or interest in the community. And then as you do more, that reflects on your profile, and then it becomes easier and easier to get funding. And that's also related to, or that also is the way that I approach identity and reputation in things like Optimism's Retro PGF.
Well, that's a great opportunity for us to shift gears a little bit to chat about that. I wanted to ask specifically what you work on at Optimism. I know you're a designer, but designers come in many stripes. So I'd love to know what it is that you're focused on at OP Labs, working for the Optimism Collective.
Yeah. So I am currently head of product design at OP Labs. My role has changed quite a bit over the past year. When I joined wanting to just be a builder. Like I think that after being in a larger corporation like GitHub for 6 years, what I craved the most was, well, I have a lot of experience that I can bring to a younger team or a younger product. I really want to be able to shape and have an outsized impact and utilize, all the skills that I've developed over the years. And it's best, I think the best opportunities to do that are with small teams that are earlier in their journey. And so initially, when I went over to OP Labs, I was working just on a little bit of everything. Like, oh, you need a thumbnail for this YouTube OP radio thing that you got going. Okay, I'll do that. Oh, you need a new marketing site for RetroPGF. I'll do that. Oh, you need a vision for how to build a profile around attestation activity. I can do that. So I was touching a little bit of everything, and then it became clear that it would be very valuable to have design leadership in place so that design is one of those things that really benefits from some centralized thinking and planning before it disperses out into, a bunch of disparate execution, because we are all about connective tissue and creating experiences that are end to end and not just, spinning off into random places and expecting users to be able to find the path between those products. So that's what I'm doing now. And the biggest focus that I've had, I think, is Retro PGF related, because we've been working to support the past and current cycle, round 2 and round 3.
Yeah.
The last two things that I think that I've had a hand in shipping is, one, the first on-chain application experience for Retro PGF. So it starts to bring some of that activity that I was talking about that help people build reputation on chain. And so hopefully going forward, the more you apply for Retro PGF and the more that you document, the things that you've shipped, the easier it should be for you to get Retro PGF. It shouldn't be this like
Yeah,
extremely
I love
arduous
that.
process each time.
I will say it was our first time applying for Retro PGF in this round, and it was our first time using the tool. It was very seamless, so props for that. And also, I loved the fact that we got an attestation at the end, kind of proving that we did it. That was really nice touch.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really exciting because I think like having this stuff on chain, it starts to be able to solve something that I don't think was possible to solve while we were at GitHub. Because at GitHub there we had somewhat of like this problem where some big corporations that rely on open source software, like they really want to put their money into open source. Like they know how valuable it is for their dependencies to be maintained and to work and to not have bugs, but they just didn't know how to
Right.
distribute it. Like that's a pretty big problem, because if you're a company like Stripe or whatever, like you depend on so many different types of open source software, and there's so many companies like that have a lot of millions to plug into open source, but they don't have the time or capacity to invest so deeply that they're figuring out exactly how much money to distribute to each project. And so
This is a sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
having some of this application experience on chain and having attestations that record the work that you've shipped on chain and starting to make the connections between that work and the impact that that work has had can get us closer to a process where maybe we can fund the open source tooling that powers the internet in a more equitable way, and make sure that the projects that are not revenue generating and are offered for free continue to receive the funding they need in order to maintain or grow or whatever it is that their goals are. So yeah, I'm really excited about RetroPGF and having that on chain.
That exact problem that you described around companies knowing that they're dependent on open source software but they don't know how to support it. That's basically what Kevin Owocki cites as his reason for founding Gitcoin originally. Uh,
Yeah.
that exact pain point. And I think RetroPGF is doing a great job of trying to tackle that problem. When we had your colleague Binji on our podcast, one thing that he said that has really resonated, and I've repeated it a few times since, is that what he loved about OP was that it tried to solve the financial martyrdom problem for people who want to
Mm-hmm.
solve problems on Ethereum, and I just love the way he put that. It's like, that you want the best and the brightest coming out of school or wherever they learn to do what they do, to feel like they can contribute and make a difference without having to, sacrifice the health of their families or any of the number of things that require money in this world to operate. So I thought that was really interesting framing.
Yeah, I think, retroactive public goods funding is, um, amongst the people that I work most closely with at OP Labs, like it's one of those things that we all feel very connected to and all are very invested in ensuring its success. And, it's still an experiment and each round is a little different and we are doing it. We're doing it together. And I'm so excited to see, the number of projects that are aware of this program and apply to this program grow each round. And I'm also so excited that it's truly like a like ecosystem thing. Like it's not just projects that, are building on optimism. It's like, if you've done something on base, like you can apply as well, because we're all part of this journey to realize the super chain vision.
Yeah, that cooperativeness you don't really see. You certainly don't see it in the meat space, and you don't even see it very often in the crypto space either. Everything's always so tribal, and so that's one of the things I think that OP is doing really well is just promoting the ideals of the super chain and the fact that you can have many different ways of using the OP stack for different audiences, etc., and it doesn't have to be cannibalistic or whatever.
Yeah, we call it the positive sum game. That's what we're trying to create. Like, oh, you did a thing that
Really.
benefits or is like free and public and it's for the community. Well, you should get to profit from that, right? Like, we want to make public goods. We want to make public goods sustainable. We want to make it profitable. We really want to. We really want to solve that impact equals reward equation, which is sort of an unofficial tagline, I suppose, of Optimism's Retro PGF program.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things we're doing here at the Noun Square to that end is we're trying to help onboard our audience to all three of the main OP chains. So we have like our Nomos on Optimism. We've been minting all of our podcasts over on Zora, and we're about to launch a new on-chain club called the Yellow Collective, which is going to be on Base. And we had a lot of thinking as a team, like, well, does that really make sense? Like, should we just be all on Optimism? Should we be all on Zora? But ultimately, we love kind of the meme of like having the infinity stones of the OP stack and like being here before like the dream of the super chain actually materializes. Because if I understand it correctly, eventually it should be fairly seamless to be able to transact between all these different stacks.
Yeah, that is the dream, and we need so much collaboration and coordination to make that happen. So I think that is it's in the fabric of Optimism's culture to be cooperative and to be partnering and to be working closely with other builders, because we definitely can't do it alone. And I think, yeah, better together. We got to do it together.
I love it. If someone's listening in right now, or maybe they're listening back later, maybe they have not heard about Retro PGF. I wonder if you could just give a quick sort of bird's eye view of what the Retro PGF program is and what it tries to do.
Yeah. Okay. So for people who are not super familiar with optimism or specifically with the term retroactive public goods funding, retroactive public goods funding, which we also just shorten to Retro PGF most of the time, is a program that Optimism runs multiple times a year where um, any project that any project or individual that has built or feels that they've shipped something that has benefited the collective. Maybe you created tutorials that help people learn how to use the OP stack, or maybe you created brand assets that got a lot of traction on social media that proliferates Optimism's collective vision. Like whatever it is that you built, including like tooling and utility and contributions to the protocol and whatever it is that you've done, if it's something that has benefited the greater community, you get to apply and submit those contributions and your explanation of those contributions and impact for a chance to receive OP reward. And I think that in round one, I think it was 1 million USD that was put up for distribution because it was like the first baby step towards this experiment. And I think round two, let me just check. Round two was 10 million OP, and round three, which we're currently in the process of assessing like all the applications and stuff, like that was 30 million OP. So all of that OP gets distributed
Wow.
up amongst all the individuals and projects that have applied. And I think each round it handles voting a little differently, and it matches, what the foundation wants to, what feels like. I think every round it's geared towards a couple of themes that the collective feels is important for the success of the ecosystem. But yeah, it's a shit ton of OP, and that's why like you should apply if you feel like you've done something helpful for the collective.
I think that should be the advertising campaign, by the way, Piff. I think it's a shit ton of OP. Retro PGF.
I think that definitely is the way to go. Yeah, that's definitely the branding.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like I mean, anyone who hears, about this vision and mission, like, of course it makes sense. If you created a public good and it has benefited other people, and you're in this ecosystem, like you should get rewarded for it. That's the only way we make it sustainable, right? Like not everyone is doing something that warrants funding or like grants or VC money or whatever. Some people are doing a smaller thing, and so, anyways, this program is an ongoing experiment. So each round is a little different, and I think what we expect is that more and more projects apply, and that this is something that is attractive to developers and attractive to contributors and builders because it rewards them for the impact that they've had. And hopefully it's a program that makes public goods in this ecosystem very sustainable and even profitable.
I think that's really a great description of it. If anyone's listening in and maybe they did have a way that they wanted to contribute, what would be your recommendation? I know this current round is already in voting, but
Mhm.
I mean, there's new quarter coming every, there's another one starting soon. So what would you tell them?
Yeah. So these surfaces are a little bit all over the place right now, I would say. I think the two places I would point to are one, we have a Gov forum where they put up what we call RFPs, requests for proposals. So in this Gov forum, there's usually one specific post that talks about what we're focused on, what the collective is focused on each season. And anything related to those themes, are things that we'd want to see. I think that, for example, in previous round, there was a lot of there was one particular category like for education, and so anyone that created educational resources, they were funding for those kinds of work was one of the prioritized categories. We also have a repository on GitHub called, and maybe I don't know if I could share a link to the space, but it's the Ethereum optimism / ecosystem - contributions repo. I think you can find it somewhere in the community docs as well. But these are essentially scoped out ideas. So if you're like a developer that's looking for something specific to build because you don't really know what to contribute, like these are both great places for you to just get ideas. I think that we're also just very excited by wacky use cases, like people who are just exploring, the boundaries of what's possible, especially related
Stuff
to
like friend tech, where
exactly,
you
yeah.
basically open up an entire new category that wouldn't have been possible without accessible L2s. There's no way
Mm-hmm.
friend tech exists on mainnet as much as I love Ethereum mainnet. It's just not no one's going to be able to do those transactions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the scope is pretty broad, but if you're looking for very specific ways to contribute, the Gov forum and that ecosystem contributions repository are good places to start if you're a builder. And if you're somebody who maybe wants to contribute something like less technical than building software. We also have a community documentation that talks about how you can support the ecosystem through other contributions, such as we have something called like support nerds and tech nerds, and we also have people who translate our docs. And all of those people, I think, also deserve to get Retro PGF. So there's so many ways to contribute. I think the thing that I usually tell people is to join Optimism, all you need to do is participate. And there are many, many, many ways to participate, whether that is through a technical route, like building software, or a non-technical route, like becoming an expert in Optimism and answering support questions in Discord. So yeah, there's it truly is like a very cross-functional effort. And there are more specific paths if you maybe are a developer or looking to deploy or looking to contribute to the OP stack or looking to participate in a non-technical capacity at the community level.
If you're a data head, the recent appearance of Vitalik on Owaki's podcast, Green Pill, I think Vitalik spent most of his time on Retro PGF talking about how he feels like one of the biggest needs in the ecosystem right now is data. Essentially, people who can figure out, what's having impact and what's not, and who's doing it and who's not. So if you have, tools that you can build, or even like Dune dashboards and stuff like that, I feel like those could be really valuable contributions.
Yeah, I think that our data team also is also building like community around just the data piece of the Optimism Collective. I think it's called Data Nerds, and I think they're finding ways, scoping out ways for people who maybe are heavier on data and analytics to be able to contribute something there. So it truly is like there are so many different things that the ecosystem needs in order to function, and there are lots of paths, and we need to clean the how to get to those paths up so that people can find them more easily.
One of my favorite things about Retro PGF is we talk about the flywheel effect a lot in Nouns, and usually when we talk about that, we're talking about CC0 and the ability for anyone to use that IP and sort of spin it out and create memes. But there's a flywheel with Retro PGF, which is like very literal, which is that like if you are helping to build what OP is building, and then the actual sequencer fees from the growth of the network goes directly back into this funding. So there's something very pure about that, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a virtuous feedback loop where we're not trying to extract from the small time builders that are doing things that benefit the collective. We're trying to put the rewards back to the people who have an impact, and so it is a positive feedback loop if we're successful.
Emphasis on the positive. Love it. Well, we're coming up on the hour here, but I did want to just put it out there. If anyone who's listening, who's here, has any questions for Piff, we have time for one or two questions before we call it a day. Prof. Werder, you came up earlier. I'm not sure if you had a question, or if anyone else in the audience does, don't hesitate to request.
No, it was just great to hear you and to hear more about, I didn't know as much about the dev side of that, so that was really cool. And to your point, like one of the things that we applied for retro funding for Nouns Builder was for the L2 chains that we put into place. And we were able to do all three. So we did OP, Base, and Zora, which was only because of that collaborative effort of allowing that open source building on top of each other. And it's just amazing to be able to offer those options. And people have different reasons for choosing different L2s. So it's great that we could do all three and give them that opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when, so Base did a round with Prop House, and I was working with them to liaise with Seneca on that. And at one point, I was talking to some folks from Gitcoin, and they were like, hey, we'd love to do kind of what Base is doing, but for PGN, the Public Goods Network, which is another OP stack chain that Gitcoin has launched. And I remember asking Seneca, sorry, I don't want to give you a headache, but do you think it's possible, to make the infrastructure changes to accommodate PGN? And I remember him just replying, oh yeah, it's like an easy lift with OP Stack. And I'm like, wow, that's, as a non-dev, but like just hearing that, like that it didn't give him a headache to think about having to implement another chain is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. By the way, I love Nouns Builder. Yeah, I think that it kind of ties back to, I don't know, this opinion that I developed over the course of my career is that so much of what my job was, and what most, I think, designers' job is in Web 2, is to find, a way to benefit, is to balance, the needs of the business that they work at with the needs of the user, and find a happy path that, basically finds a compromise, or finds like a very positive path that supports both needs. And the paradigm shift in working at a company like OP Labs, where pluralism is a good thing and we want to give users choice, and we don't want all of them to drive to the same front end to do like a specific thing. It's definitely a difference in how we approach design problems, and we think instead, okay, how do we make the data layer open instead of the front end? Because we no longer need to prescribe the best way to do something or the right way to do something. Many other people can provide different options, and so users have choice. And yeah, like I think now, people who used to have to decide which L2 to deploy on, like hopefully in the future that's not as much of a decision that feels like, you can't back out of, and thus is like this huge business decision almost.
Yeah, just join us. You know that meme, the Homer meme? Just join us. It's okay. The water's warm in the OP stack. I have one more small question for you, which is a very specific question, but I've always loved the little, I don't know how you would describe them, but the little drawings, little utopia drawings that are featured all over the OP website. I wanted to know, are those you're doing or someone else's?
They come from like a handful of different artists and designers we collaborate with. I think, watch this space. I think that we will be sharing more concrete visualizations of the collective soon.
I love it. I love that so
it's gonna be a good time.
Kevin Owaki has done a lot of that too. He's done a lot of like really interesting visualizations of like the quadratic lands and whatnot. If you look through his blog posts and stuff, I just love that kind of stuff. It's fun to visualize, and because we are like living in several different network states all at once, and sometimes it's nice to just visualize it as being a little more of a physical utopia that we can all be in.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's also helpful for people who are not necessarily crypto native to have something that's visual that they can attach to sort of make sense of, all of these different concepts and all of these different communities and worlds, essentially, and how they connect, if they connect. I think that it'll also open up these spaces to people who are not necessarily super knowledgeable about Web3 or the crypto space, or Ethereum even.
I think that's what attracted me personally to the OP stack versus other L2s, which I've definitely experimented a lot with other L2s like Arbitrum and ZK Sync, and there's some really great technology on a lot of these. But there's just such a cultural pull from OP, and I think that's really what it comes down to. Is just this like feeling of community rather than something like Arbitrum, which is actually building a really great product, but it just feels very corporate to me. And that's not shots fired; it's just decisions made about the way that they wanted to position their offering. But for me, I think OP is where it's at from a community perspective.
That's great to hear. Yeah, come for the vibes, and our visual identity has to portray those vibes.
Exactly. Well, I want to say thank you to Pif for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we probably could have talked for twice this time, but we'll just have to book you to come back on another time. It's been really great hearing about your journey and how you came to be working with OP Labs and with the Optimism Collective, and appreciate you educating us today.
Well, thank you so much for having on. I'd love to come back to talk about Nouns stuff sometime. I still got to write my little distillation of what it was like to enter this community, because I really love Nouns. I think what y'all are doing are awesome, and I feel like a level 1 Nouns person, sort of growing my capacity and understanding of the space.
Leveling up every day.
Yeah,
I love it. If you ever want to talk about nouns, I heard there's a space being held every single day forever. So if you need somewhere to come
There are
jump
some
in.
people who just talk about nouns every single
I
day.
know, it's pretty crazy.
Love it.
All right. Thank you so much, Piff. Thanks to everybody else who came. Thanks for sharing, everyone who did. And coming up in 2 minutes, we've got the Little Nouns show, so don't go too far. We'll shut down this space and wind up the new one in just a minute. They're going to be hosting Daniel 100 ETH to talk about his Web3 journey and the work he's doing with Transient Labs. So join the Littles here in just 2 minutes. And I think, Prof, you're hosting that one for them, so you definitely don't go too far.
I am.
Thanks, everybody. Stay nounish.
Yeah, I'm not
Stay
going anywhere.
optimistic.
Thank you. Yeah, stay nounish,
You're
stay
on Retro
optimistic.
Radio.